Hello and welcome to the Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark 7, and as always I'm very pleased to have you with me for another discussion of military history. Today I'd like to conclude our look at the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and its wartime career. Up to now we've discussed the aircraft itself, the offensive strategic fighter role for which it was designed, as well as the evolution of the aircraft itself and the mission of the Zerstorer units which flew it as they were modified under the pressure of wartime experience. I hope that I've been able to give a fairly complete idea of how the 110 was used as an offensive weapon system. Now, I'd like to look at the fighter's other major wartime use, that of a specialized anti-bomber weapon in a strategic defensive capacity. As part of the air defense of Germany and its occupied territories in Europe against the Allies' strategic bombing offensive, the 110s would fly by both day and night for most of the duration of the war. In terms of numbers, this was the largest contribution of the 110 to the German war effort. This story is a much more singular one than that of its various uses in the attack and can be treated fairly in a single episode. This will finally finish up our in-depth examination of the 110. My main sources for this one include Bf-110's Zerstorer Aces of World War II by John Wheel, the main source from which the material for this series as a whole was drawn. Also using the book Bf-110 vs. Lancaster 1942-45 by Robert Forsick, an excellent and concise source of information on Zerstorer's part in the German defense against the night bombing offensive. So now, I'd like to take us back to start off with an early war engagement that was covered in earlier episodes, the 1939 clash between German day fighters and British Wellington bombers known as the Battle of the Heligoland Bight, or the Battle of the German Bight. This action was the climax of the first British bombing offensive, which took place during the period of hesitant inactivity in the West that followed the initial battle in Poland that has become known to history as the Phony War. This period was not inactive at sea, and an alarming string of naval reverses in the first month led RAF Bomber Command to commit its squadrons in support of their naval comrades. Methods of intercepting enemy ships at sea that they initially used were ineffective, so they began flying so-called armed reconnaissance sweeps over the North Sea and the German coastal waters. These would consist of unescorted formations of twin-engine bombers, the best of which they had at the time was the Vickers Wellington. These bombers took heavy losses when they encountered German interceptors, but despite this, the RAF leadership insisted that with experience they would be able to protect themselves and carry out their task of suppressing enemy shipping, striking at surface warships and U-boats. This was a reflection, in part, of the ideas which many air power theorists held in the interwar period that, quote, the bomber will always get through. The obstinacy with which this was held in the face of adverse battle experience is a reflection of the stubbornness of inter-service squabbles for scarce funding, in which the RAF's argument for its expensive bomber program was that it would give Britain an unblockable, massively destructive deterrent. Especially given the publicity with which some of the air power exponents made their arguments for bomber fleets capable of leveling Germany, and British propaganda playing up its capacity in this regard, it is surprising but true to find that the Luftwaffe had made only the most general and vague arrangements regarding air defense. Units of single-engine fighters which happened to be stationed in the areas of Germany near the coastal areas in question were expected to repel these attacks, but little coordination existed between them. Among these single-engine fighter squadrons at this stage in the war were several Zerstorer units which were at this time still flying the D Model 109. During the lull between offensives, it was a natural step to include these fighters in the air defense organization that was growing up to meet the threat. As these units converted to the new Bf-110C, they continued to fly in this air defense role. The big fighters' long range and heavy firepower meant that they were able to meet the bombers far out to sea, chase them far out again on their way back home. This was the first intentional use of the Zerstorer as a bomber-destroyer, and they proved themselves effective in this role. The greatest proof of this came on December 18, 1939 in the Heligoland Bight action mentioned above. In this battle, a force of 22 RAF Wellingtons was decisively mauled by a German fighter force that included 110s from ZG-76, who shot down 6 of the 11 bombers destroyed. Though the numbers involved were small, the fact that more than half the force was destroyed for no effect on the target, which was the harbor at Wilhelmshaven, spelled the end of the British daylight bombing offensive. This would determine the character of the air battle soon to be fought over Germany. After Heligoland, British bombers would only appear over Axis-controlled territory by day under exceptional circumstances. Coming of the Western campaigns and the Zerstorer Arm's heavy involvement in the offensive operations undertaken in them put an end to this phase of the 110's career as a daylight interceptor. The termination of the period of intensive action in 1940 with the slaughter of the Zerstorer force in the Battle of Britain had a very great effect on the use of the 110 afterwards. Only a relatively small force would remain flying in their original strategic offensive fighter role. And even this, as we've seen, had been considerably changed and expanded by operational experience. From now on, most of the 110s would have a new job. The British, after the shock of the Bight, had not stopped coming. they started coming by night. The 110, with its ability to sail off for hours, its heavy armament, and its two-man crew, was found to be very suitable as a night fighter to intercept and bring down the RAF night raiders. From this point until the end of the war, most 110s would fly by night against the steadily growing air fleets from across the Channel. One thing that is striking to the reader of accounts of the early British night bombing offensive is the very rudimentary technique employed by both sides. The early flights were plagued by operational problems that rendered their efforts to strike targets in Germany and occupied Europe almost useless. The problem of night navigation over a blacked-out landscape proved to be a much greater one than had apparently been anticipated by the RAF. Add in bad weather, unexpected winds aloft, and the results of their navigational technique, which is mainly dead reckoning, became quite shocking. A photographic survey of bombing results found in August 1941 that a large proportion of bomber crews flying by night were unable to reliably find the target city, much less a particular target within that city. Bombing accuracy was correspondingly dreadful. Out of every 10 bombs, only one was found to fall within 5 miles of the designated target. In one extreme case, the crew of an RAF Whitley bomber attacked an airfield in England, believing themselves to have been over occupied Holland. The British may have underestimated the problem of long-range night navigation by observing the greater degree of success had by the German bomber crews in finding English cities during the night bombing phase of the Battle of Britain, known as the Blitz. This was because the Germans had in fact anticipated this problem and produced a solution, the Knickerbein or crooked leg system. This technique was derived from radio-blind landing aids developed by the German national airline, Lufthansa, in the interwar years. Transmitting stations in Germany sent 2 radio beams over England, which were directed to cross over the target. An indicator on the bomber informed the pilot when his aircraft was on the beam, and if he was drifting off showed him the direction to steer to remain on it. The bombers would follow this beam until the system indicated they had entered the crossing beam, at which point they would know they were over the target and release their payloads. The British would develop radio navigation aids of their own, known as G and oboe, which allowed a bomber to fix its position by triangulation based on signals from transmitters in England. These aids came into service near the end of 1941 and became widespread. They were limited in range by the need to maintain a line of sight to the transmitter in England. They could therefore only be used as far as the industrial targets of the Ruhr, and then only by aircraft flying at very high altitude. A special target marking unit, flying high-altitude mosquito bombers, was created to fly ahead of the main bomber force and drop markers consisting of colored parachute flares over the target. These pathfinders, as they were called, were the elite of the RAF's navigators. But even they, and even with the use of tools like oboe and G, were not entirely reliable. In September 1939, Bomber Command had on hand 349 twin-engine bombers. These consisted mainly of Whitleys, Hamptons, Blenheims, and Wellingtons. The last of these was the only one that had any real potential as a strategic bomber, but even it lacked the payload and range necessary to conduct a serious bombing campaign against Germany. The Whitley and Hampton were mid-1930s designs that were outdated in 1941. They were relatively small machines, capable of speeds a little less than 250 miles per hour, or about 400 kph, and with ranges of about 1,600 miles or 2,600 kilometers. They carried bomb loads of 2 or 3 tons and a few .303 caliber machine guns for self-protection. These characteristics left them very vulnerable to Luftwaffe fighters. Both would be retired from Bomber Command service by 1943. The Blenheim was a modest step up in terms of performance, but carried less than a ton of ordnance, and this limited its use in anything other than a purely tactical role. The Vickers Wellington was the most suitable of the bombers the British had on hand for the task of striking at German war potential from the air. The bomber had a considerably longer range than the other types in service, and though it was a little slower than the others and had a normal payload of only a little over 2 tons, its ability to reach deeper into the enemy's territory meant that it would become the mainstay of the British bomber force until the planned 4-engine heavy bombers became available in quantity. These would begin to reach the squadrons in early 1941, with the short Stirling and the Handley Page Halifax flying in small numbers by March 1941. The Avro Lancaster, the last and most capable of the 3 British heavy bombers, appeared in December of that year, but would not begin active operations until March 1942. All of these bombers had much greater range and bomb-carrying capacity than the smaller bombers discussed above. As the Wellingtons represented the majority of the aircraft available at the time, however, big strikes against targets deep into Germany, beyond the range of the Wellington, would not begin for some time after the introduction of the newer 4-engine planes. The introduction of these much more capable aircraft was still getting up to speed, however, and throughout 1941 the proportion of 4-engine bombers in Bomber Command's frontline strength would reach only 25%. Though they may have held the initial edge in night navigation, the German night fighting technique was so rudimentary as to be virtually non-existent. What there was dependent on moonlight or special conditions such as the long, dim twilight of the high latitudes or an enemy contrasting with lights on the ground. Sometimes fighters would act against bombers in cooperation with searchlight units, attacking planes caught in the light beams. This latter method usually exposed the fighters to damage from their own anti-aircraft batteries, which would also engage the illuminated bomber. This risk of being shot down by one's own flak would be a constant factor in the lives of German night fighter pilots from this early stage on. It is not uncommon to find that this is the leading cause of night fighter losses in any given month. This relative unpreparedness is the more surprising given the German investment in radar. The German radar program had produced a pair of ground-based sets which were in operation in the earliest stages of the war in the night skies. These were called the Freya and the Würzburg sets. The Freya system was a long-range early warning radar with tall fixed aerials emitting long wavelength impulses. It could detect formations of aircraft at distances of more than 200 kilometers, or about 120 miles, but it lacked the resolution to pick out individual planes. The shorter wavelength Würzburg set was capable of this. This set was a smaller installation using a dish antenna. Its greater resolution meant less range, however, and was just over 70 kilometers or 40 miles. These two radars would become the eyes of the new German night defense system that was soon to be devised and implemented in response to the growing British threat. The first successful night fighting system was devised by a Luftwaffe colonel, Josef Kammhuber. The system he created was called Himmelbett, which means four-poster bed in German. This consisted of a chain of Freya and Würzburg radars extending along the coast from Denmark into central France. The airspace along the bomber approach routes was divided into areas called boxes, to each of which were assigned searchlights in a single Bf-110 fighter. These would be put on station as Freya radars detected the approaching bombers, and as the intruders came into Würzburg range, a pair of these radars would activate. One tracked the enemy aircraft, while the other tracked the 110. Luftwaffe personnel on a control station on the ground would vector the waiting 110s onto approaching bombers entering their assigned box. The system was rapidly expanded and would become complete by the end of 1941. This system had its flaws, but it worked surprisingly well. In some cases, it was supplemented by the Spanner Anlage, an experimental infrared imager that was intended to aid the 110 in making an intercept. This device proved useless, since the range of the system was so short that it was useful only at ranges in which the night fighter crew would very likely to have detected the aircraft unaided. The Himmelbett system would serve the Luftwaffe well in the early part of the war, before effective British countermeasures would degrade its usefulness. In the absence of a practical airborne radar set to fit in the 110, this was the best solution that the Germans would be able to implement. The construction of the Himmelbett defense began the contest of electronics, forcing the rapid development of this infant technology. As first the British and then the Germans introduced measure, then countermeasure, and then countermeasure. The British, at first, found one of the chief weaknesses of the Himmelbett system, the inability to concentrate fighters in a small area. Since each box could handle only one night fighter at a time, losses could be minimized by sending the bombers in on a narrow frontage, thus passing through a smaller number of boxes on their way through the line. A bomber at cruising speed passed through a box in a matter of minutes, and the vast majority would evade the night fighter entirely. Thus appeared the tight, dense bomber streams that were to characterize RAF night raids. Another common countermeasure was the jamming from England of the wavelengths used by Luftwaffe fighter controllers on the ground to communicate with the aircraft aloft. As an alternative to the brute force jamming effort, a method utilizing some more finesse was often used to disrupt the system, in which German-speaking operators in England would broadcast false instructions on known night fighter frequencies, hoping to confuse and mislead the crews. 110s that were used in these missions were part of the Nachtjagdwaffe, or the night fighter arm, and belonged to 8 numbered night fighter wings, or Nachtjagdgeschwader, abbreviated NJG. Many of these night fighter wings were made up of groups of 110s from the Zerstorer groups deactivated after the Battle of Britain. Others were formed from scratch, and by spring of 1942, 9 groups of night fighters were on strength, fielding 150 Bf-110s. These were stock machines, unmodified for their new role except for details such as flame dampers on their exhausts. There's a mix of all the models produced up until then, with C, D, and E models serving in the night fighter ranks. The latter 2 models form the majority. Other aircraft also flew alongside the 110 in the night fighter squadrons. 35 Dornier Do-217s were also on strength in March 1942. These were fighter conversions of the medium bomber. These aircraft had performance and speed sufficient to hunt the bombers, and the space and crew to help with communications and navigation, as well as to operate the electronic gear that would soon appear. Similar fighter conversions of other German medium bombers, such as the Junkers Ju-88, would also fight alongside the 110s in this night battle. The failure of the primitive infrared imaging gear may have given some impetus to the German effort to create such an airborne radar set. The Germans were already developing a workable set, and a prototype was ready by July of 1941. This is known as the Funkerrad 202 Liechtenstein, sometimes abbreviated FUG-202, a set operating in the UHF band and using 4 large dipole antennas projecting in a cruciform arrangement from the fighter's nose. The antenna array caused a lot of drag and slowed the plane down, and the unit's range was only a kilometer or two. It gave the night fighter the ability to operate independently of ground direction, which was prone to jamming, but in conjunction with the ground controller, the radar made an interception much more likely, as the fighter only had to be vectored to within radar range of the target, at which point they would likely pick it up on their own set and home in with that. This was test flown and found to be satisfactory, with a testbed aircraft using it to intercept and shoot down a Wellington on the 9th of August. The first sets were retrofitted into E-Model 110 serving with NJG-1 in late summer 1941. At about the same time, deliveries of the Bf-110F model began. This model's F4 variant was the first specialized night fighter version of the 110, with the new radar built in. At first, development troubles with the radar limited the number produced, but by early 1942 the Germans were fielding substantial numbers of radar-equipped 110s. Operating within the Himmelbett system, they were highly effective, and brought down large numbers of British bombers until the next big move in the technological contest in early 1943. But before we turn to the second half of the night campaign, let's take a look at what was going on during the daytime. Here, the other half of the air war over Germany, one involving a new and very powerful opponent, was beginning. Hitler's declaration of war on the U.S. in the wake of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was the last nail in the Nazi coffin. With the failure of the Wehrmacht to subdue the Soviet Union, the addition of the American industrial colossus to the ranks of her adversaries made the chance of a German victory very remote. America's industry, which had been producing equipment for many of the world's armed forces throughout the immediate pre-war years, was pulled out of the Depression in part by foreign arms sales. American arms of all kinds were found in just about every corner of the world. The American military, especially the U.S. Army Air Corps, the predecessor to the colossal post-war U.S. Army Air Force, was another story. It sounds odd in ears raised in the late 20th century or after, but traditional American policy had been very hostile to military spending. It was normal before the 20th century for the Americans to maintain a minimal national peacetime military establishment, which would then be expanded in case of an involvement in hostilities. This had been the case in the Civil War, as well as in the First World War, but the latter experience had showed the limitations of this policy in an age of mechanized total warfare. The long lead times on some high-technology weapon systems, such as warships or combat aircraft, made the normal American practice of rapid expansion from scratch in case of war unworkable. In particular, they meant that once such an expansion program was begun, it would begin to deliver such weapons in quantity only after perhaps 2 or 3 years. This was less due to production difficulties than to the intensive research and development effort needed to ensure that the weapons which were produced were not hopelessly inadequate. Therefore, efforts were made to maintain some military establishment in order to maintain current operational experience and to stay abreast of developments abroad. However, the U.S. Congress, the part of the American government that controls funding, was very unwilling to spend more than a very limited amount of money on the military. Again, this sounds odd to present-day Americans, and to those elsewhere with even a minimal acquaintance of the last half-century and more of American military policy, but such parsimony towards even basic defense measures used to be as American as baseball or apple pie, as the saying goes. This was true, with a short exception during the American involvement in the First World War, straight up until the late Depression and New Deal years right before the Second World War. As a result, the American military services, like their counterparts in the UK at this time, who were facing a similar shortage of military funding, competed fiercely amongst themselves for a share of what little was available throughout the interwar years. I mention this because some of the officers of the Army Air Corps were convinced that the only way to see their service grow, and to have access to higher levels of peacetime funding, was to emancipate itself from the Army and be established as an independent branch of the armed services. In order to do this, it had to create an independent role for itself and be able to sell that to Congress and to the American public over the competing claims of the established Army and Navy, which were jealous of their control over the growing air services. Their answer was the idea of strategic bombing. U.S. Army Air Corps men argued that the use of fast, well-armed bombers to strike the enemy's war potential at home was the cheapest and most efficient way to deal with the enemies that the U.S. might face in the future. Investment in a fleet of big 4-engine bombers would enable the U.S. to pulverize the enemy nation's vital industries with impunity from high altitude, making large armies and navies, and their associated expenses, unnecessary. Similar arguments were made at the same time in the UK by air power proponents of the RAF for very similar reasons. A theory was propounded whereby bottlenecks in enemy industry would be found. Ideally, these would be commodities or products, the disruption of which would deprive large sections of war production of necessary materials or components. To illustrate what they had in mind, let's look at how this idea was applied in wartime. Much of the early United States effort was directed against German production of ball bearings. This was the kind of critical bottleneck target that the pre-war theorists had explained the destruction of which could cripple an aggressor's arm production. Almost half of all ball bearings used by German industry were produced in two large plants, and they were essential components of a huge variety of armaments from high-performance aero engines to panzer turret rings and much, much more. By attacking these small but crucial producers, the strategic bombing advocate said, which could be eliminated by a relatively small force of heavy bombers, production of all downstream products would be curtailed. The production and operation of bombers to destroy German weapons before they were even assembled was a much more economical means of fighting them than by deploying ground troops to destroy them all in combat. Though they did not win separate branch status before the war, they did obtain some funding for the development of the weapon they claimed would be able to win this kind of war, four-engine heavy bomber. Isolationist and anti-war sentiment was very strong in the country during most of the interwar period, and as a result, offensive weapon systems like heavy bombers were accurately perceived as instruments of aggression and were not politically viable. So, in admirable American marketing fashion, the strategic bomber project was rebranded as a defensive weapon, an anti-shipping weapon designed to meet enemy invasion fleets and destroy them far from American shores. The U.S. heavy bomber program resulted in two excellent machines that were to become frequent antagonists to the Bf-110. Both were fast and heavily armed, and had ranges with a 3-ton bomb load of more than 2,000 miles, or more than 3,200 kilometers. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was the more rugged of the two, and the first to be produced. The first prototype, known at the time by the internal Boeing designation as the Model 299, made its first flight on July 28, 1935. The first production models were delivered to the Army in October 1939. This first batch of aircraft was small, as the big bombers were expensive and funding only allowed for the procurement of a few at a time. Defensive armament was heavier than most bombers, with positions for 5 machine guns, a mix of 30 and 50 caliber models. This was very light compared to what would become standard on later and more widely produced B-17 models. Successfully upgraded versions saw it gradually given more and more armor and guns, until the final G models were carrying 13 or more 50 caliber machine guns. The consolidated B-24 Liberator appeared later, with the prototype flying just before the close of 1939. It would enter service with the American Army Air Forces in mid-1941, and with the British soon afterwards. Like many American aircraft of the late 1930s, a great deal of the early production, in many cases the majority of it, was financed and carried out to fill export orders. It was the more modern design, with a long high aspect ratio wing and a slab-sided fuselage. It was faster than the B-17 and had a similar range, but a lower operational ceiling. It also carried a very formidable defensive armament, consisting in this case of 10 50 caliber machine guns. Both of these aircraft would be produced in huge numbers. More than 12,000 B-17s came off of American assembly lines. Including the naval versions, the PB-4Ys, more than 18,000 B-24s were made, making this the most produced American combat aircraft of all time. Both served with British Commonwealth Air Forces and continued to do so for years after the war. In American service, however, they were obsolete upon the end of the war, and all but a few in various secondary roles were discarded. In some cases, brand new machines finished in the immediate post-war days were delivered straight to the scrapyard. The Americans brought fighters too, mainly the P-39s and P-40s that had been already encountered by the Luftwaffe in British and Russian hands. They also brought the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning. This was another twin-engine fighter, but it reflected a different design philosophy to that of the Zerstorer idea. The Lightning was a single-seater, intended not as an escort, but as a high-performance bomber interceptor. It was very fast, close to 100 miles an hour faster than the 110, due to its powerful Allison V12 engines and its unique twin-boom design. However, it suffered from many of the same deficiencies of the 110 in air combat against high-performance single-engine fighters. Against the 110, the match was fair, with the advantage to the Lightning due to its greater speed. Nevertheless, the Germans would tend to prevail in the early battles between the two as their veteran crews went up against green American pilots. The two heavy bomber types would rarely appear together, however, as they were geographically and organizationally segregated into different units. The 8th Air Force, based in England, was the more famous of the two and almost exclusively flew B-17s. The 9th and 15th Air Forces were based in Africa and the Mediterranean, later in Italy, and they flew B-24s. It would be liberators of the latter formation that would be the first American heavy bombers to come to grips with the 110. This encounter happened in the eastern Mediterranean on the 21st of August, 1941, when two 110s of 3rd Group ZG-26 came upon a group of 9 of the Wehrmachts, as these 4-motor bombers were termed by the Germans, as they attempted to attack an Axis convoy. The Zerstorers attacked and brought down 2, proving that the 110 was as deadly against the American heavies as they were against the RAF's Wellingtons at the Bight. This minor action was the beginning of a contest between Zerstorer and heavy bomber that was to last for the next year and a half. First appearance of the American heavies in northern European skies was on the 17th of August 1942, when 12 8th Air Force B-17s attacked the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen in occupied France. This tentative raid was a warning of things to come. Luftwaffe response to this new threat was varied. Some single-engine fighter units would be pulled off of other fronts, mainly the Russian, in order to meet the new bombing offensive. New units were also created to fight the daylight bomber threat. Part of this response recalled the success of the 110s against daylight bombing raids earlier in the war, as U.S. fighters were unable at this time to escort their bombers all the way through to the targets due to their limited range. The twin-engine machines, it was thought, could operate against the American formations with a probability of success. The first moves to create 110 formations to combat the American menace was made in response to the increased intensity of the bombing following the adoption of the point-blank directive by the British and the Americans. The issuance of this joint directive may be considered the beginning of the intensive phase of the Allied combined bombing offensive. The German response was to call upon the men and machines of the first group of the newly activated ZG-1. These were the former members of the Schnellkampf ground attack formations which had originally served on the Russian front and had now returned there after their time spent flying against the Allied forces in the Mediterranean. Recalled from their new Russian station at Orel, they were sent to Luftwaffe bases near Hanover where they were retrained for the anti-bomber role. New crews were also assimilated and losses made up, and the remaining units of this wing were eventually retasked with this duty. 2 groups, now redesignated as the new ZG-26, were based in stations from which they could cover the northern approaches. The third, still a part of ZG-1, was based in Austria to protect the south. A third wing, the new ZG-76, would be reactivated in late summer of 1943. This would consist of only 2 groups though, like the other 2 wings, and efforts would be made to expand them to full establishment, often using other heavy fighter types such as the Ju-88 or the 410. These second-generation Zerstorers benefited from the resumption of production of the F-model 110 after the disappointing performance of its intended successor, the 210, resulted in the cessation of the newer plane's manufacture. As a result, a variant, the F-2, of this model, was introduced and optimized for the bomber-destroyer role. In this version, the bomb racks were deleted and provision made instead to carry 4 21-centimeter WG-21 unguided air-to-air rockets under the wings. These were Army artillery rockets, or Wurfgranate, of the same kind used in the Naval Warfare Multiple Rocket Launcher. The underwing launch tubes were elevated 15 degrees upwards to help compensate for the heavy rocket's considerable gravity drop when aiming. The air-to-air version of the rocket differed from its artillery version by the use of a time fuse instead of a contact fuse, and a larger 41-kilogram or 90-pound warhead. The weight saved by the substitution of the bombing gear for the anti-bomber armament also made the F-2 faster than the other combat versions of the F-Model 110, topping out at a little over 310 miles per hour or about 500 kph, in aerodynamically clean condition, but the drag created by the rockets hampered the fighter's performance while it was carrying them. Later in the battle, another dedicated bomber-destroyer variant of the 110 would appear when the new G models using the more powerful 1500 horsepower DB605B engines were introduced and began to enter service. This was the last version of the fighter and was more robustly constructed than the earlier models. The cannon armament was enhanced by the substitution of the newer MG 151-20 20mm automatic cannon for the MG FF-Ms used in previous models. The backseater also received a firepower upgrade, as the rear cockpit armament was also increased by the replacement of a single 7.92mm machine gun by a twin MG-81Z of the same caliber. The major change from the previous models, however, was the wide variety of field conversion kits which could be applied to the G model, allowing for a great diversity of weapons loadouts from fighter to fighter. One such conversion, the G2-R5, would replace the normal gun armament with a very formidable battery in the form of 2 20mm and 2 30mm weapons in the nose, as well as an adapted 37mm Flak 18 anti-aircraft cannon carried under the fuselage. The devastating firepower carried by the G model in this configuration could be used in the bomber-destroyer or the anti-tank role, but the performance of the plane was so badly affected that comparatively few were so modified. The G2 could also be fitted to carry the same WG-21 air-to-air rockets used on the F-2 model. Tactically, the 110s were used in conjunction with the single-engine fighter units. The American bomber's best defense was the maintenance of a very tight and disciplined formation, in which the individual aircraft could support one another with their defensive machine guns. Thus, any fighter seeking to close in and attack one bomber must in theory face the combined firepower of as many as 10 or 12, which together could bring as many as 50 or 60 guns to bear on the attacker, depending on the angle of approach. This daunting amount of firepower was a serious handicap for the single-engine fighters, who were often armed primarily with weapons not much longer range than the 50 caliber machine guns used by the bombers, and thus must enter the sphere of their defensive firepower to make their attacks. The 110s and their heavy long-range weapons were the counter to this formation. As specialized Puck destroyers, a German term meaning formation destroyer, the heavily armed 110s would use their weapons to lob ordnance in among the bombers from well outside the range of their defensive machine guns. Shells from cannon up to 50 millimeters in caliber, as well as the heavy rockets mentioned above, were used to cause damage to individual bombers and knock them out of place in the formation, creating chaos and disrupting the formation more as the others strove to evade. The rockets were especially effective in this practice, as the big flash and visibly approaching trails of fire and smoke were sometimes enough by themselves to unnerve the bomber pilots and cause them to attempt panic evasion maneuvers to avoid the oncoming missiles, thus wrecking the formation. After the long-range bombardment of the formations that detached individual aircraft or small groups from the machine gun umbrella of their comrades, they became much easier targets for the waiting single-engine fighters, which would then tear into the stragglers in the broken formations as well. It was a very effective method, and the Zerstorers achieved many victories over the American airmen. The 110s proved very dangerous to unescorted bombers, who had no way to strike back at the twin-engine fighters. However, they could only perform this function and survive in the absence of Allied fighter escort. In the months of mid to late 1943, the Allies were unable to send fighters along with their bombers all the way to the target in Germany. Escorts would be sent, often an inter-Allied force of RAF Spitfires and American P-47 Thunderbolts, but these would have to turn back short of the target, often well short of the target. Very often, the long-range 110s would follow the formations at a distance off the beam, and at the sight of the fighters turning back, move in to begin the assault. An example of the kind of effect a determined defense using this method could achieve can be seen in the August 17, 1943 battle opposing the U.S. attack on the cities of Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The raid was sent out in two sections to hit, in the first city, the before-mentioned ball bearing plants, and in the second, the Messerschmitt manufacturing center there. A total of 376 bombers were sent, along with 4 groups of Spitfires and Thunderbolts. When the latter ran short of fuel and turned for home, the Germans pounced. Rocket-firing 110s scattered many of the combat box formations, and swarms of Bf-109s and the newer radial-engine Focke-Wulf FW-190s moved in to attack. The 110s also continued to harass the bombers, especially those of the Regensburg force. These bombers left England first, and after a 90-minute battle with the Luftwaffe fighters during the unescorted portion of the run hit the factory, then headed south across the Alps to land in North Africa. This unexpected path led them to evade most of the single-engine fighters, who after the initial battle with the bombers on the way in had been forced to land and refuel, and had then headed back north to deal with the Schweinfurt force, now on the way in. However, the 110s were able to stay aloft and harry the formation on its outbound leg well into Italy, shooting down more bombers and forcing others to put down in neutral Switzerland due to battle damage. Though the Americans had made it through the Germans to hit their targets with effect, the losses they sustained in the effort were catastrophic. 60 bombers were lost, and many that made it back had to be written off due to heavy damage that they had sustained. Nothing daunted, the Americans launched a second strike on the Schweinfurt ball bearing works in October. Again, they ran into the coordinated German fighter defense. This time the results were even worse. Out of the smaller force of 291 B-17s used in this raid, another 60 were destroyed, along with 17 written off after returning, and of those that remained, more than half had sustained serious damage. This second blow at the hands of the Luftwaffe fighter defense briefly led the Americans to consider the viability of their strategic bombing offensive, and suggestions for a transition to night attacks in cooperation with the British were heard in some quarters. However, the situation was soon to turn abruptly and decisively in the Americans' favor. In December, the North American P-51 fighter flew its first missions with the bombers. This aircraft was perhaps the best propeller-driven fighter aircraft of the war, very fast, agile, and armed with a heavy battery of 6 50 caliber machine guns in the wings. The important factor introduced by the new Mustang, however, was its range, which allowed it, using drop tanks, to accompany the bombers all the way through their entirety of their attacks. The appearance of the high-performance American fighters in German skies was the end of the usefulness of the second-generation Zerstores as part of the German daylight air defense. The 110s were totally outclassed by the P-51, and by similar long-range P-47s which would soon join them, which were a match even for the very high-performance German single-engine fighters now fighting alongside them. This was compounded by the heavy weapons the Zerstores carried, which were generally useless against the American fighters and only made the Zerstors clumsier and more helpless against them. The 110s once again faced catastrophic losses like those suffered in the Battle of Britain, but this time the toll taken was even more extreme. In one action, on the 20th of February 1944, a squadron of 110s from the 3rd Group of ZG-26 flew against an American raid. Out of 13 Zerstorers committed, 11 were lost. On the 16th of March, another squadron from this group lost 11 of 17 fighters committed against a raid on Berlin. In May, this group was broken up and used to form an experimental unit using the Me-262 jet fighter. At the same time, the survivors of ZG-26 were taken out of the battle and sent to re-equip with single-engine fighters. The other remaining 110-equipped units soon followed suit. The last unit still flying the 110 in a daylight role were the fighters of ZG-76, who sustained disastrous losses against an American raid on March 16, 1944, when the wing lost 36 out of 43 110s committed. This group would be re-equipped with the 410 and sent back into the fight, but even this much improved descendant of the 110 was completely outclassed by the American fighters. In November, they would be withdrawn to re-equip with single-engine fighters. This was the end of the Zerstorer arm, with the single exception of a 410-equipped maritime patrol group based in Norway. Having dealt with the defeat of the Zerstorer arm in the daylight battle over Germany, let's return to the parallel battle fought by their comrades in the night fighter arm against the RAF night attacks. When we left the nighttime battle over occupied Europe, the situation was as such. RAF bomber streams, using radio navigation aids and preceded over their targets by specialized Pathfinder target marking units, were confronted with an effective German air defense organized around radar-equipped 110s acting in conjunction with ground radar and control stations. Possible field of RAF incursion was effectively limited to the rural industrial area, both by the range with payload of the twin-engine Vickers-Wellington bomber, which was still the most numerous in use, as well as that of the radio navigation aids available to guide them to their targets. The situation would continue into early 1942, when the first phase of the night battle came to an end. This first phase, characterized by some amateurishness and trial and error in technique, as well as by the relatively small size of the numbers of aircraft involved, gave way to a period of progressive refinement in technique and growing scale of force on both sides. The night battle thus became more deadly. In the coming months, the German defense would become more and more effective, and bomber loss rates began climbing. They would eventually come to number double the figure of the previous year. During the remainder of the year, the electronics arms race continued, with the British introducing the Monica device, a short-range tail-warning radar that would alert the crew to the presence of an aircraft approaching from behind. This turned out to be less useful than had been hoped, as frequent false alarms were given by radar returns from the other bombers nearby in the stream. Worse still, the Germans developed a device called Flensburg, which could detect the emissions from the Monica radar, and home a fighter in on the bomber's tail that it was ostensibly protecting. The British also experimented with a radar-directed automatic gun turret, the so-called any evidence of this device engaging a night fighter, successfully or otherwise. The British also began to field their own long-range night fighters, often fighter variants of the twin-engine Mosquito fitted with airborne radar. These were not usually sent as escorts in the bomber stream, but instead performed intruder missions. This kind of air superiority mission was engaged in by the night flyers of both sides. In British practice, it involved long-range fighters loitering in the dark skies near German night fighter bases to catch the unsuspecting 110s as they took off or came into land. In response, the Germans developed an Axos device, which was able to detect the radar used by the British night fighters. They also produced a more refined airborne radar, the Neptune, and upgraded marks of the FUG-202 set. Throughout this time, the RAF raids grew in size, and the proportion of heavy bombers increased, especially the proportion of Lancasters, which would become the mainstay of Bomber Command until the end of the war. Bombing accuracy was still awful, but better, and while the rate of losses to the 110s and other night defenses were steadily creeping upwards, they remained at a sustainable level, averaging about 4% of the bombers involved lost on any particular raid. On the German side, about 50 110s had been lost, the majority lost not to the defenses of the enemy, but to collisions or friendly flak. By this time, the night fighter units were flying specialized versions of the 110. These were variants of the F model, the F4. These were the first dedicated night fighter versions of the 110, equipped with the Liechtenstein FUG-202 radar. By the beginning of the new year, an improved night fighter model of the 110 would appear, the G4. This was a variant of the more powerful 110G, which was equipped with radar and had a provision for a third crewman. Like the before-mentioned G2 bomber-destroyer variant, the G4 night fighter was compatible with a wide variety of field conversion kits mounting a variety of weapons, loads, and specialized gear. The G4s would gradually replace the remaining F4s as the battle went on, and would be the final version of the 110 to see service. It was also the most widely produced, with more than 1,800 built. A major change would come to this situation in 1943. The occasion was a series of raids carried out against the city of Hamburg. These attacks were codenamed Operation Gomorrah and represented the first sustained effort of the RAF to destroy a German city. The Bomber Command Chief, Sir Arthur Harris, had instituted a policy of so-called area bombing, that is, unaimed bombing of a geographic area, in response to the general inaccuracy of the RAF effort. Now he had in hand a powerful force of 4-engine heavy bombers, the cooperation of the U.S. Army Air Force, and the new H-2S ground mapping radar. This was a navigational aid that directed a radar beam onto the ground and produced a crude picture of the landscape beneath the bomber. The radar was primitive, but it allowed the raids to progress beyond G or oboe range. Harris also had a secret weapon. This weapon, which had been available for some time, had been saved for this occasion, to maximize the effect of its introduction. It was codenamed Window, and it consisted of bundles of strips of aluminum foil cut to lengths which would reflect the German radar impulses. The raids began on July 24th. As the bombers approached the Kamm-Huber line, their crews began to drop the bundles overboard, creating slowly falling clouds of metal foil strips. The German radar system was effectively blinded by this, as every part of the cloud of Window created a return on the German radar screens, swamping them and making the actual bombers indistinguishable. Losses fell sharply that night as very few interceptions were made. A second raid on the night of the 27th-28th got away with light losses also, and wreaked unprecedented devastation on the city. Tons and tons of high explosive and incendiaries fell into the residential districts of the city, creating thousands of fires that swelled together into a thing never before seen on the surface of the earth, a firestorm. The massive conflagration at the center of this raised temperatures into the thousands of degrees and sucked in air from the surrounding areas in the form of hurricane-force winds filled with burning debris. It's unclear how many citizens of the city perished in this Holocaust, but estimates place the figure at above 40,000. So cataclysmic was the destruction that even those who found shelter in well-prepared underground bunkers were cooked alive inside them, or suffocated as the inferno consumed the oxygen from the air. More raids would follow in the course of the next week, including 2 daylight attacks by American B-17s aimed at industrial and communication targets, and another large night firebombing raid. After this second fire raid, a terrible exodus occurred as the terrified citizens fled without plan away from the devastated city and out into the surrounding countryside. Though much more destruction was wrought, nothing like the original firestorm occurred. Window was used in the subsequent night raids and produced a similar dislocation of the German night defense. RAF losses in the Gomorrah raids were minor compared with those of the preceding months. The effect of the introduction of Window was to throw the German defense into confusion. This, coupled with the jarring effect of the massive toll in death and destruction caused by the Hamburg raids, gave the subsequent post-Window phase of the night battle a grim and very ruthless character. German countermeasures were pursued with great vigor, and by the end of the year a device which could detect the emissions of the H-2S ground mapping radar was available. Refinements in German radar and operating technique gradually overcame the initial disruption caused by Window, and the rigid Himmelbett system was superseded by a new night fighting method known as Wilde Sau, or Wild Boar. This was a more decentralized approach. Night fighters would take off and circle a radio beacon, until directed toward the bomber stream by ground controllers broadcasting on multiple frequencies, who kept up a running account of bomber positions and likely targets. This method allowed concentration, but required greater crew skill and increased the chance of friendly fire incidents and collisions. The successful innovation introduced by the night fighter arm appeared in mid-1943. This was a new kind of airborne gun installation, known as Schlagermusik, a German term translating to crazy music or jazz music. This consisted of a pair of 20mm MGFF automatic cannon mounted in the crew compartment firing upward at a near vertical angle. The first of these units were retrofitted into F-4 Model 110s. The Schlagermusik was devastating when properly used. British bombers had no weapons capable of firing below the aircraft, and no easy way to detect a fighter there, especially in pitch-dark conditions. Using the upward-aimed cannon, the 110 could position itself underneath a bomber and fire at point-blank range with impunity into its underside, where hits were very likely to strike the bomber's payload or fuel storage. Many 110 crews downed multiple bombers in single engagements using this unusual weapon. One example of the success the night fighter pilots could have with this weapon is provided by a mission flown by the relatively inexperienced pilot Lieutenant Peter Ehrhardt against an August 17th raid on the rocket research and V-weapon facilities at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. In less than 20 minutes, he used the Schlagermusik to destroy 4 Avro Lancaster heavy bombers. About a fifth of future production G4 night fighters would be equipped with this new weapon, which remained deadly right up until the end of the war. One reason for the lack of British response to this lethal new threat was the fact that cannon involved rarely used tracer ammunition, which, combined with the unusual angle of attack, often left RAF crews with little idea of where the deadly fire was coming from. The raid on Peenemünde above bears witness to the increased competency and ferocity of the post-Hamburg night battle and the proportions of aircraft lost on both sides. 15% of the RAF bombers were lost, a rate which would be unsustainable in the long term, while 8 110s were destroyed. During the period through mid-1944, the nightly battle was carried on at a very high level of intensity, with Hamburg-like campaigns against German cities met by huge fleets of defending night fighters. Aided by its refined tactics and improved equipment, and operating in greater numbers, the night fighters became very dangerous. In one action on the 23rd-24th of August, more than 700 RAF bombers attacked the capital, Berlin, as part of a multi-raid campaign against the city. They were met by a force of more than 200 night fighters. In this and in 2 other raids, the British lost 125 attacking bombers, for the loss of about 10 defending night fighters, of which 6 were 110s. On average, in the period mid-1943 to the end of 1944, 10 British bombers were lost for every 110 shot down. German radar research would eventually replace the FUG-202 Liechtenstein set with the SN2 set, which was unaffected by window, as well as more advanced Doppler shift-based sets that made the bombers easily distinguishable against the background of window interference. The British were not to discover the wavelength on which the SN2 operated until much later in the campaign, and were thus unable to detect or jam this new system. Eventually, enough G4 night fighters with the new set were produced to introduce a new tactic, the Samesau, or tame bore system. This involved vectoring the fighters into the bomber stream as it approached, which they would then enter, finding bombers with the SN2 radar all the way along the route to and from the target. This led to a corresponding rise in bomber losses, as well as a reduction in 110 losses, as most of the fighting took place away from the target area where they were not exposed to friendly flak. The situation would remain essentially unchanged until the end of the war. The tactics of the night fighters remained quite deadly to the RAF bombers, and they remained in operation until the very last days of the war, although in dwindling numbers. In the final months of the war, when the Germans could fly in their own skies only by night, and with more advanced night fighters in use, G4 Model 110s made up only 1/5 of the remaining night fighter units. They remained deadly right up until the end of the war, as evidenced by the feat on February 2, 1945 of Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who used his Schlager-Music-equipped G4 to destroy 7 Lancasters in a series of attacks lasting just 19 minutes. Only the exhaustion of his fighter's ammunition supply kept him from a still higher tally. Ironically, the increasing threat to the night fighters in this final phase of the battle came from the crushing Allied air supremacy by day. After mid-1944, U.S. Army Air Force daylight bomber aircraft began to support the night attacks by strikes on night fighter airfields, and the increasing disruption of German fuel and transportation system by Allied aerial marauders ranging freely over the country in the daytime left many of them grounded for lack of gasoline. Indeed, so unchallenged were the Allies in the air by day that it is somewhat baffling that the RAF persisted in mounting their raids by night, which had now become far more dangerous. This stubbornness as to mode of attack was one of the more costly errors in judgment of the RAF leadership. Counting Lancaster bombers only, 467, crewed by a total of more than 3,200 men, were needlessly lost on night operations in the last 4 months of the war. And there I'm going to end my account of the career of the Messerschmitt Bf-110. I hope I was able to give some sense of the interest that I find in the story of the dramatic clashes in the upper air above occupied Europe. I've always found the strategic air war fought here fascinating in the sense that the technology and methods used were old enough to have conventions surrounding their employment, but still new enough that individual devices or tactical innovations could have the potential to transform the character of the battle. In any case, I hope you found some of it interesting and useful at least, and as always I'd like to thank you for listening. So that being said, I hope you'll join me for the next episode of The Record of Arms, when we'll turn our attention to the Spanish army on the eve of the military revolt that sparked the disastrous Spanish Civil War. Until then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.